Good morning and welcome to Resilience and Rebuilding, Learning from Other Cities. My name is Kelsey Schell. I'm the Environmental and Sustainability Strategist here at the Museum of Contemporary Art. This is the second program in a series on the immediate impacts of the recent fires and long-term rebuilding strategies for our city that center ecology and community consensus. This program was jointly organized with the MoCA Environmental Council, in particular, co-chairs Andrea Bowers and David Johnson, and advisor John Quigley, with support from Elitza Oros, Emily Mofford, and Ariel Pittman. Environmental programming at MoCA is made possible through the generosity of Nora McNeely Hurley and the Manitou Fund. In a program focused on land, it is particularly important, as ever, to recognize that we occupy land originally and still inhabited and cared for by the Tongva, Tataviam, Serrano, Kizh, and Chumash peoples. We honor and pay respect to their elders and descendants, past, present, and emerging, as they continue their stewardship of these lands and waters. We acknowledge that settler colonialism resulted in land seizure, disease, subjugation, slavery, relocation, broken promises, genocide, and multi-generational trauma. This acknowledgement demonstrates our responsibility and commitment to truth, healing, and reconciliation, and to elevating the stories, culture, and community of the original inhabitants of Los Angeles County. We are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these ancestral lands. The ultimate goal of these programs is to develop guidance for rebuilding efforts from within and beyond the art sector. We hope that you will join this evolving conversation by submitting questions for our speakers through the Q&A tool at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and there are also directions to do so in the chat. We also hope you will join us for the next program in the series on April 29th at 11 a.m., exploring strategies and tools for a greener rebuild, including traditional ecological knowledge, fire-safe rebuilding materials, community-oriented design, and the complexities of fire insurance. I'm now going to hand things off to our moderator, Adam Mahoney. Adam is a reporter at Capital B News, a Black newsroom. His work has been cited by the U.S. and Illinois Supreme Courts and the White House. It has altered Chicago's vaccine rollout plan, led to several cities using federal funds to shelter houseless people, and used by activists and organizers nationwide. He is from Los Angeles and has reported from more than a dozen U.S. states and 5 countries. Adam, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kelsey. And good morning, everyone. Thank you guys for joining us as we gather to continue our conversation about the impacts of the recent devastating wildfires in Los Angeles. Like Kelsey said, my name is Adam Mahoney, and I'm really honored and super excited to share space with our panelists today and to learn from their expertise as we explore how communities recover and rebuild after climate disasters in ways that not only prioritize ecology, but also maintaining community structures and our collective well-being. I think, by examining these different case studies and examples of what has gone right and what has gone wrong in our nation's recovery process, in Lahaina, in Paradise, in New Orleans, I think we'll be able to take a lot of hope for folks in Los Angeles, but also guidance for long-term sustainable recovery efforts that extend well beyond the immediate, situation that we're facing. I've been reporting on disasters and climate change for the last couple of years, and what I've noticed in my own reporting is that a lot of times the urgency of, recovery efforts means rebuilding as quickly as possible. We want folks to get back to their homes and get back into their communities, but oftentimes speed, as we know, does not align with equity or sustainability. And there's a lot of pressures to rebuild, and that comes from a lot of different sources, whether it be the government, land developers, or even economic and tourism-related stressors. So, those things shape these systems and our recovery efforts in a way that doesn't always prioritize local communities. And I hope that in our conversation today, we'll navigate that tension a little bit. And we'll interrogate how we can ensure that rebuilding efforts in Los Angeles and beyond are not only prioritizing infrastructure, but elements of public health, environmental justice, and long-term resilience. So each of our great panelists that are joining us today have experience and a lot of knowledge in these different places. They've navigated the federal bureaucracy attached to recovery, and they fought for community-led planning and solutions and pushed for innovative environmental solutions, all while balancing the realities, that I've mentioned and all the different stressors and the push and pull of our recovery system. So before we jump into a Q&A, we'll start with a couple of, we'll allow the panelists to introduce themselves and the work that they've been doing over the last couple of years. And first, we will be turning to Nancy Convard and Diana Felton from Lahaina. Nancy is the Strategic Program Development Manager for the Hawaii Department of Health's Environmental Management Infrastructure Project. She has played a crucial role in Maui's wildfire response and recovery, overseeing environmental monitoring programs that track the long-term impacts of wildfire pollution on soil, water, and air quality. Diana is an ER physician and medical toxicologist who currently serves as the chief of the Hawaii Department of Health's Communicable Disease and Public Health Nursing Division. She has worked extensively at the intersection of climate change, health, and disaster recovery, ensuring that wildfire survivors receive the long-term public health support they need. Thanks for joining us, Diana and Nancy.
Okay, I guess we can jump right into it. As you see, we have Diana and myself in two sort of different roles, but I need to acknowledge and thank Diana for her role in, she was here on board, well, for a long time with the Department of Health, but at the beginning of the fires, I came on about 3 months into the, after the tragedy. But before I do that, I do want to also acknowledge how honored we are to participate in this conversation and what a great panel this is, and we're really looking forward to it. So we are on Oahu, not actually on Lahaina, but of course we traveled over to Maui as needed. And what I'm going to do is ask, well, we have up there on the screen the Maui Wildfires data portal, because even though that's a dashboard, it's a data portal, it really encompasses what we were trying to accomplishing on the environmental monitoring side. And that's to be as transparent as we could what environmental monitoring was being done, where we were sampling and doing the environmental monitoring, and communicating, what those risks were to people in as layperson friendly as we possibly could to, as we'll talk about later, we have very diverse communities in Lahaina. And with that, so we talked about what we monitor and why. If you scroll down on that screen, you'll see there's what we call a conceptual site models, which is where people might get exposed to different things. And that's why we sampled where we did. We had a resources page where people could turn, we don't have to click through all of them, but where people could turn and get advisories and specific information, resources. I mean, it's scaled back over, right? We update this as frequently as necessary. So what the information communication needs very early on varied a lot from what happened later in the in our ongoing recovery, in our response and recovery. We also talked a lot about data sources and quality because we wanted this, and it was open to all sorts of NGOs provided information, University of Hawaii provided data, other government agencies provided data, but we all didn't do things necessarily the same way. So we talked there on that data sources and quality a bit about understanding what data the Department of Health could use for decision making and what data we could use for substance and context, because it's all very valuable data, but we have to make sure everybody understands what how each of those data sets informed decision making or informed the context of what we're doing. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Diana real quick to talk about her role, maybe some of the initial activities. Thanks,
Sure,
Diana.
yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Diana Felton. Really appreciate being here with this panel and having this conversation today. As a native Californian, my heart goes out to everyone affected by these fires. We've, are a little further out from the experience here in Hawaii, but it still impacts us in many ways. But my role with related to Lahaina has been around sort of the nexus of public health and environmental health. We are a small shop here at the Hawaii Department of Health, so we wear many hats. So, my team also set up a clinic right away in Lahaina because there was no other options for healthcare in that area. We did a lot of home visits, and a big part of what I will likely talk about today is about thinking about timing of resources, how the recovery and response changes over time, and the needs of the community change over time as you get further away from the disaster and different challenges and opportunities arise. So I'll stop there and we'll go on to the next panelist.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nancy and Diana. Next, we'll have Steve Crowder, who'll be joining us over the phone. Steve is the mayor of Paradise, California, a town that was nearly destroyed by the 2018 Camp Fire. Since then, he has been instrumental in leading Paradise's recovery, from advocating for power line burial to navigating the complexities of federal disaster aid and rebuilding in a way that prioritizes safety and sustainability. Thanks for joining us, Steve.
We're just unmuting Steve, if you guys will give us one moment. We're so grateful that Steve.
Good morning.
Oh, there he is. Wonderful. I was going to say, we're so grateful Steve is in transit and is making it happen. So I'll mute myself now. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you for having me. It's always my pleasure to share our story. Ours is a little bit different. There have been obviously other fires here in California. At the time we had ours, nobody had experienced a 95% loss of their town. So we had absolutely no playbook to go to. I was elected 2 days before our campfire. So I made a real grand entrance. We had practiced evacuations and everything in our town. As we had a fire in 2008, it never got into town like the campfire did. So we thought we were prepared. We were prepared, but not for a fire of the magnitude that we had. So that particular day, the fire was spreading at like 6 football fields a second. It started about 12 to 15 miles away from us, and within an hour and a half, it was in town. We had probably 150 spot fires in town before before the main fire ever got here. Our evacuation system, we had a code red system, which some people were notified, some weren't. Our PD was getting calls about this fire, and they were getting the information out that they had. The fire wasn't here. That it was in Polga. So a lot of confusion that day. Sure if I still, I don't know if I still have a connection.
We're hearing Steve.
Okay. Hang on and let me change over here.
And I think in the meantime, Steve, I think it's a intense and great introduction to kind of what has happened in Paradise. If you can switch over to, I'm going to just mute you for a moment and switch over to Tap's introduction, and then we can circle back on questions. So Adam, I'll send it to you.
Yeah, thanks, Kelsey. Next we'll have Tap Bui, who is a community development leader with over 14 years of experience working in New Orleans East, a neighborhood in the city of New Orleans. As co-executive director of Song Community Development Corporation, she has led efforts to engage Black, Indigenous, and communities of color in disaster recovery, equitable development, and advocacy, ensuring that in post-Katrina rebuilding efforts center community voices and long-term resilience. Really excited to learn from you, Tap.
Thank you all. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Tap Bui, and I'm the Co-Executive Director of Sound Community Development Corporation here in New Orleans East. I'm really excited to be here with you all, but also wanted to take this moment and acknowledge and honor the indigenous communities of the Chitimacha, Atakapa, Caddo, Choctaw, Homo, Natchez, and the Tunica, whose land we currently reside on. So I guess our natural disaster is a little bit different from our my panelists here, but with Hurricane Katrina, it was one of the most devastating storms to impact directly in the New Orleans region. We are coming up on the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina this year, which also coincides with the 50th fall of Saigon. So there's a lot of planning happening to kind of talk about climate resilience and like the resilience of a community 50 years later. So here to talk really about the work that we did immediately after Hurricane Katrina, but also keeping an eye out on long-term sustainability and long-term recovery, and what some of the strategies could be developed now that could prevent some of the things that we've learned that has not or has worked in the last 20 years. Um, Specifically, our long-term recovery is still under threat by climate change, and that's just going to get worse. And so, how do we build sustainable practices and look at nature-based solutions? Because New Orleans is an old city, right? We have failing infrastructure already, with our sewage and water board, with just buildings collapsing. Um, but I think on the other hand, when we look at community development, it's also the people that we're also working to empower and involved in some of these long-term strategies. So how do we sustain movement building, especially in the Deep South, and continue to empower residents to take action? Because at the end of the day, community organizing can be really hard. It's really hard to sustain. It's really hard to get the general masses involved because it can be very issue specific. Um, so not everyone can relate. And I think the last point I want to touch on as we come up on questions is this questioning on sustainability. There's going to be a lot of funding that comes into the neighborhoods that are devastated by the fires, but that money will go away. And so how do we build, again, like sustainable practices, but what does sustainability mean to you as an organization or as an individual? Because for us as a nonprofit, we should be working towards sunsetting an organization that was formed to respond to long-term recovery efforts and not necessarily sustain or work. Because if we're sustaining the work, we're sustaining the issue, and that issue is never solved. So it's just like framing how we think about long-term sustainability in recovery. Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tap, and I appreciate you bringing in the fact that maybe a hurricane looks a little different and feels different than a wildfire, but with climate change and the increase in these disasters, no matter where you are, these are things that you need to be thinking about, and the impacts will be felt pretty similarly. But that being said, we are going to jump into the Q&A now, and I wanted to first pose a question for Nancy and Diana, because I've been thinking a lot personally, and with folks that I've been talking to in Altadena and LA County who've been impacted by these fires about the public health threats that have, arisen since the wildfires. And a lot of times when we think about maybe some of these immediate health impacts, we think about in the first couple of weeks. But as we know, like pollution, whether it be air pollution or soil and water contamination, those are things that fester and can impact the outcomes of folks living in a community decades from now. So I'm wondering if we could, start this conversation focused on how communities can, one, catalog the different threats that they might expect to see, and also how can we prioritize equity in the ways that we are facing and battling these threats, because as we know, vulnerable groups are typically the ones that feel the impact first and worst.
I think it makes sense if Diana starts off on this because she was there. And one point we're going to make is that the health concerns, it was a cycle, and it changed over time what our initial concerns were versus our longer term concerns, as you alluded to, Adam. So since Diana was on the ground from the get-go, I think Diana should jump in and talk a little bit about that, and then we can talk a little bit more about the longer term.
Sure. Yeah, it's really going to vary. The public health risks are going to be pretty variable depending on the individual family and community and, what occurred. I think certainly, you know, environmental contamination is a significant concern. Our building materials are not good for the environment. And after a fire, a lot of, the residual building materials end up in the environment, which is part of the reason why we've been so um, sort of dedicated to environmental monitoring and ensuring that our water is clean and our beaches are safe for people in the ocean and the fish are okay for people to eat or recreate in. And I think that is all extremely important. And considering the initial cleanup is very important to consider where the pollution might be moving, where anything residual from the fires might go, and ways to mitigate that. I do think it's really important to acknowledge that the mental health impacts from a trauma and a disaster like this often are going to outweigh some of the environmental health risks, but they're all important, of course, for people who want to live their sort of healthiest lives. But I think it's really important to emphasize, that the mental health impacts are going to be broad. They're going to impact large swaths of the community, and not just people who lost, their belongings or their loved ones, but other parts of the community as well. And given that a lot of people find solace and mental health support in the environment and the outdoors and the ocean, I think it's really important that work is done to ensure that those areas are safe and can be used safely. And I think Adam asked something about equity and ensuring, and I think that's a really big and really important question. And really varies. In Lahaina, we had some really interesting learning. We have a very diverse community across Hawaii. We knew Lahaina was diverse, but we even learned about small pockets of communities that we weren't aware of. So one of the big lessons we really learned is you really have to go in and seek out all of the community voices and not just those who are well organized, not just those who are sort of known as a vulnerable community or vulnerable group, but that there's often many other sub-communities that may not have a voice, may not be as well known, especially to a state government entity like our health department. And you really have to seek that out and try and hear from all different sides and aspects of the community to really understand what people need and when they need it.
Thanks, Diana. And I would just add to that, because Diana really captured it very well, is from the strictly environmental health impacts. I mean, I also agree that the mental health is probably the longer term, and it's the equities around folks' access to services for that is something your DOH has certainly tried to step in, but it's I think part of the longer term solution. But that also goes in the environmental monitoring science in that. Oddly, we didn't have, not really oddly in hindsight, that it's the building material, the heavy metals turned out to be our major risk drivers. The fire was so hot that we didn't get the dioxins and pHs and things that we normally would have thought. And being an island environment, the air quality, outside of the fire itself was good very quickly. Is that when we did our environmental monitor, we had to think about that comfort of the community, comfort of the workers, and comfort, I mean that in terms of the psychological stress. Sometimes it was important to do more monitoring and more areas to make sure that we were providing the information and a level of comfort to folks about the environmental quality.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I think, obviously the way that we define health and the markers of health are really broad. So I appreciate bringing in the mental health aspect. And that actually makes me wonder for Steve, if you could speak to one, all of the amazing victories that y'all have had in the aftermath of the fight around, organizing to make sure that, the rebuilding of Paradise has been one, equitable, but also forward looking. And it has really shifted into becoming a blueprint for the ways that places can rebuild, but also how you were able to garner community support and action when folks were carrying these different burdens, whether that, be the mental health or economic burdens that come from, recovering from a disaster.
Yes, we had an amazing community, and we immediately, probably 2 weeks after the fire, started having community meetings at Chico State, because it was the only gathering spot that we could come up with, because Paradise was closed for about 4.5, 5 weeks after the fire, because of trees and dangerous situations and what have you. Immediately, we started asking our citizens, what is it you want to see in rebuild? And the number one want was underground utilities. And our fire was caused by our local utility company. And they were at the very first meeting, and they heard that. They agreed to underground our utilities. Our telecoms went along a little bit kicking and screaming, but they did go along. We just kept our citizens informed and had many, many meetings of what they wanted to see. Our fire's been 6+ years. We're about a third of the way rebuilt, about a third of our population back. And twice now we've updated what our long-term recovery plan was, because some people did not come back. We've got new people, so ideas have changed a little bit. We're rebuilding with more resilient products. Health and safety is a huge concern, and we want to try to mitigate this from happening again. So we just listened to our citizens, and we encompassed our building codes accordingly. And the idea was to get people home as quick as we could, but had to be safely. And that's kind of where we're at today. Our undergrounding from our utility will be finished up later on this year, and then we'll start our paving projects. So we're well on our way to recovery.
Yeah, that is amazing. I did want to pull something out of that for you, Tap. I mean, Steve spoke to the fact that only about a third of the community is back now after 6 years, and I think that is one of the major things that we have seen and struggled with post Katrina in New Orleans. We saw hundreds of thousands of people not return to the city for various reasons. I'm wondering if you could speak to like how different forces led to maybe such a large share of the city not being able to come back to New Orleans, and how, almost 20 years later, community groups are still responding to that. If you can offer any tips for, folks in, Altadena who are they're generational homeowners who might not have the financial means to return to a place where homes are pushing over $1 million now.
Right. And I think you really hit it on the nose in terms of like what are the major factors, and it's really the economic factors. So where we are in New Orleans, if you know the geography of the city, we're in New Orleans East, which makes up about 60% of the landmass of New Orleans, and about 40% of its taxpayer base. But we're literally at the tip of the map, and sometimes like our neighborhood doesn't even come up on the map. So one of the things that this Vietnamese community had done well was being able to return at a rate that was not like seen elsewhere in the rest of the city. So more than 95% of our residents returned back to New Orleans East 3 months after Katrina. And that really was through the coordination and efforts of the local Vietnamese Catholic Church. The pastor at that time traveled out to different displaced areas and had conversations with individuals, to try to understand, like, when are you coming back? Why aren't you coming back? What's holding you back? And a lot of times it's like, well, what are we coming back to? There's nothing left. And so what I think was really successful in the Vietnamese community was that they didn't rely on outside assistance to help them get back on their feet. They relied on each other. So if neighbors were coming back, if one knew how to do roofing, they traded services for another that knew how to do electrical work. And again, like the strong Catholic influence is like it's big here, right? Like Father Vian, who was the lead pastor at the time, like 2 weeks after Katrina or a month after Katrina, went back and snuck back into the community and hosted mass in a church that had no lights, no electricity, no water, and word got around. So the following week, like it doubled in numbers in terms of like who were coming back to show up because they heard that church was hosting its mass. And so by the end of October 2005, more than 2,000 residents returned to attend mass. Um, so I want to say that that's not the same as, our brothers and sisters in the Lower Ninth Ward, right? Where they didn't have coordinated efforts as like the Vietnamese Catholic Church. They didn't have the means to come back. They couldn't rely on each other for like, bartering of services. And I think one of the biggest barriers that we saw was that there was no clean titles on a lot of these homes. Like, yes, we were trying to build generational wealth, but at the same time, insurance companies were trying to track down 13 family members to try to understand where clean titles were for their homes. And in Louisiana, we follow a very old school law systems. And so already just to try to get anything like rebuilt or happen to the or renovated for the homes, they had to get like permission from all like 13 family members who will own that title. So these are individuals that fall through the cracks, right? Like you think this house has been in my family for generations, like we're good, but if there was no clean line of succession, these are the individuals that you would lose through the cracks because there are no other economic factors that are helping them achieve um, you know, being their recovery and rebuilding efforts.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that into the fold. I'm thinking about, the point you made that it really does matter what you're coming back to. Like if you don't know what you're coming back to, what is the driving factor there? And I want to bring in a audience question that speaks to this a bit. And maybe this might be a question for Nancy or Diana, but the question is, what are your opinions on FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, only sacrificing the top 6 inches of soil and not conducting any further contamination testing on Altadena properties? And this goes back to the point of like, if you can't trust the government or trust the place that you're going back to is health and safety and it's going to be able to meet your needs, why would you do it?
I think that falls to me that's on the contamination, and I'm not really sure though. Obviously, I've been asked questions about what FEMA is doing in Altadena, but here in Hawaii, we had really no information about what these kind of this kind of fire, what kind of impacts we'd had. Never had anything like it, and they did conduct the confirmatory sampling after they removed the ash and debris, according to our DOH guidance, used our screening levels that we'd established for those constituents. And then they went down. They did stop at 12 inches. That's as far as they would go. They did a second scrape after the 6 inches. If there was any exceedance, and then they took a look at the data, and while they wouldn't go any further, they consulted with us about the potential sources of that, because we obviously you can have situations where there's sources other than the fire for these things, and also what the health risks were to the homeowners, which were communicated actually from the USACE toxicologist to in the reporting to the homeowner. So my understanding is FEMA felt more comfortable that they had appropriate data for the Altadena area, but I couldn't really speak to what they had and why, if and or should they have been comfortable or not with it. I just don't have access to that information. But in terms of what we did in Lahaina, we had comfort.
Yeah, thank you. That actually now makes me think for Steve, because you've been going through this recovery process under 2 different federal administrations that operate with different priorities and principles. I'm wondering if you could maybe speak to the different challenges under a Trump administration, maybe in this recovery process versus a Biden administration, or if you see any differences in that work in Paradise.
Well, we had FEMA also cleaned our properties, and pretty well in the same way that they did Hawaii. And as they cleaned, they tested, and many times they came back and took more soil, and then they issued a letter of clearance. Again, I can't speak to what they're doing in Altadena. What I've been told is they felt that that was sufficient, and that anything that was lower than that would not be an issue. So it was just different than what we had. As far as the administration, I don't think that made much of a difference with our fire. We started under Trump and continued under Biden. I think our bigger challenges I'm more concerned about now are we have a long ways to go to recover, and we have a lot of programs scheduled, roads and evacuation routes and what have you that have been FEMA funded, and for like 2028 through 2030. And I'm concerned about those with the cuts that are making. So we're kind of up in the air about that, and that's my biggest concern right now.
Yeah, that is. Thank you for bringing that into the fold as well. I mean, it's a big issue that we are seeing nationwide, not even in places that are facing disasters, in terms of how they're going to respond to potential cuts and those kind of fundings. I'm wondering, and this is a question for the entire panel. We are in the space now where it's about to be pushing 3 months since the wildfires first broke out in LA County. And I think it was Nancy who made this point earlier that the threats shift as time goes on in this recovery process. But if you could place yourself back in 3 months post-disaster, what would y'all say were the most critical decisions that were being made? And what do you wish someone had told you in those moments in terms of what the process would look like going forward?
I'll jump in just from the community perspective here in New Orleans. So for us, it was just being civically engaged in processes. Vietnamese residents in New Orleans East can be very insular, right? Like our population size is not that as big as California's, where we're only at like 7,000 strong in a residential area, but we're all within a 1 mile radius. But I think because we're so closed off and like based on where like the social and physical isolation, um, people didn't know what it meant to be civically engaged. It wasn't until the mayor at the time decided to designate New Orleans East as green space. So like sacrificing this entire area to be flooded in case other disasters come so that we can act as a buffer for the rest of the city. It was then that individuals are like, no, we need to have a voice in this. Like, this is not right. Our community has already returned and started the rebuilding process, and it's, we can't be ignored again. So I think for us, it was the first time we saw cross-racial, intergenerational community organizing, and it was about like how do you sustain that momentum and still stay civically engaged as we navigate, other pieces of the recovery part.
For us in Lahaina, I think at about the 3 month mark, that was really a key time to really think about what the community needs were at the time, what they had been, maybe they were changing, and trying to adjust to that sort of cycle of needs for people. About 3 months was about when we did a community needs assessment, which was a survey of impacted areas. We went to hotels where displaced people were living. We went to, homes nearby where people were, their home had survived, but they had been impacted in, multiple ways, and really tried to get a sense of what the community needs were at the moment. And we were a little surprised. This was 3 months in, but people at that time were still just overwhelmingly concerned with housing and economic stability. They, from the information we learned from that, people did not yet have the bandwidth or the ability to think about their chronic preventative health needs. They weren't thinking about, gosh, I need to go in and see my doctor for, a mammogram or a pap smear. They weren't thinking about even some of the environmental health issues were too far down the list of priorities for people, even at the 3 month mark. And that was a big wake up call for us to really be careful about overloading people with worries, with guidance, with information, because we really wanted to support people in a way that didn't add more to their plate than they could handle. I mean, the resiliency of people and the community was just amazing, but adding on more worries, adding on more guidance, adding on more things we suggest people do, there's a point where it doesn't help anymore. And I think really trying to recognize where those fine lines were and how to slowly incorporate additional things to help people, recover some of the things that were farther down their need, their hierarchy of needs, was a really big sort of turning point at about that 3 month mark for us.
Yeah, and if I could take the liberty of extending that timeline out, then you get, about 6 months out, and we were able to, share that the environmental monitoring is demonstrating that it is safe to be there, being careful, of course, in areas where there's still ash, but people started shifting from being worried about, is it safe for me to go look at my home? Is the environmental quality safe? We'd already by then, established that it was safe to recreate, and the beaches were safe if they were open. They were not open for physical hazard reasons and keeping the area secure for debris removal and the like. But so they're moving past that, and then people were concerned about, how do I rebuild? Can I rebuild? We have requirements for cesspool conversion. A lot of the homes were on cesspools, and we had to think about how can we be practical. These people have huge expenses and everything in front of them already, but under our normal rules, if you were rebuilding, you would have to upgrade, and we worked out a transitional period for that and guidance around that. So Diana's right. In the first 3 months, people weren't ready for months, and then another at 6 months, I think there started to be another shift to where people's focus are. And then, other resiliency and climate concerns started raising. Should people be rebuilding right at the coastline? Because that's where they historically were, but we know that they would be under threat to sea level rise and storm surge moving forward. We have a number of cultural and historical requirements that people really cared dearly about and came out as a concern in the rebuild, as well as that point Adam made early on about we want to rebuild quickly, but we want to do it in a sustainable, resilient, equitable way. And how do you balance all of those rebuilding efforts? So I think it's important to think about that longer timeline. As the time moves along, those priorities and needs of the community change.
Yeah, yeah. Steve, before you answer, I'd love to hear your answer as well about the 3 month mark. But I'm also wondering, given that y'all are, further along in the rebuilding stage, if you could bring into the fold some of the conversations about shifting the rebuilding process physically when we're thinking about construction and materials being used, because that's one of the biggest issues in Los Angeles is we're working with the older housing stock that is full of, a toxic soup of concoction of different chemicals and materials. And if that's something you've been thinking about as y'all have been, years into the process at this point.
So we were we were fortunate. We had Sierra Nevada Brewery right after the fire donated a long-term recovery company to us to help us with our long-term recovery. We immediately started having meetings, which was really well attended. We had our community, we displaced 50,000 people during the Camp Fire, and there was no housing anywhere near. So people were 2, 3, 4 hours away, different states away, but they still wanted to come home. So these meetings that we had, we'd get 800 to 1,000 people at these meetings. And we had A-frames set up with what is it you want to see, what will make you feel safe coming back. And this went on for probably 8 months. And we had probably at least 2 meetings every 6 weeks. And so we got a sense of where people were going and what they wanted. Our rebuilding started. Our first house came back about 13 months after the fire. And that's what we really focus on. But again, we built maybe 5 houses a year pre-fire. All of a sudden, after the fire, we're on a pace where we're building 500 homes a year. We didn't have the staff for that. So we brought in a development company, a contract company that could handle our building plans and our inspections and all of this. And they were with us about 3 years until we could get up to speed. And we also looked at alternative building. There's a lot of foam block and Quonset huts and all kinds of things that we normally wouldn't have, but we want to build resilient enough where we can mitigate this from happening again. So that's the avenue we've come. And right now, 6+ years, probably a year ago, we're probably more in an economic redevelopment stage now than a recovery stage. And our housing is going very well. Our businesses coming back are lagging. And I don't know if I hear, well, we want to see more rooftops first and number of population comes back. So that's probably our biggest challenge right now, are the commercial businesses coming back.
Yeah, that's another great point. I mean, I think in LA County, there has been tens of thousands of structures that have been destroyed, but more than half of them were actually businesses and commercial buildings. So that is an important part that we do need to be thinking about as we move forward through this recovery process. I know we only have a couple of more minutes. We were hoping to stay beyond the hour, so I hope y'all in the audience choose to stick with us. But Diana does have to leave at the top of the hour, so I did want to pose a final question to you, Diana, from the chat. If you could maybe speak to the importance of community spaces in long-term recovery. You spoke to the point that immediately after the fires, y'all opened up, kind of a mobile clinic for people, understanding that wasn't something that was being met at the time. Can you speak to the importance in developing those spaces, and then how you can make sure that they are prolonged spaces that continue, after, down the line after these disasters have passed?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question and really important. Yeah, we found, so we had some things that occurred in Lahaina that you could put in sort of the luckier column. I mean, it was all horrific and disaster, but the community center for the town was one of the few buildings that survived, right outside of the sort of primary burned area, but still very central. And it included a large gym, which was where we held the weekly community meetings, and actually still holding regular community meetings so it was also a place where a lot of the sort of service providers who came from other places that needed space to set up could, get in touch with people. It was like sort of it was in some ways a resilience hub or a recovery hub or a response hub, where a lot of services, for example, our public health nurses did lead testing for people at the community center during events to help reassure people that they hadn't been exposed to large amounts of lead after they had gone in to, look at their properties, etc. So that was good. And then also next to that building was an old state building that had sort of been abandoned years ago. And we were able to very quickly turn it into a clinic, but it became so much more than that. It became, as you say, a community center. We had a garden space in the middle. People would come and work the garden. We had, in addition to primary, real basic primary care, like getting people their insulin and they may have lost in the fire, their medications, we were able to bring in optometrists and provide, get people new glasses. And we had dentists and podiatrists and pediatrics, and really a sort of the whole scope of as much healthcare as we could bring in. And that was really beneficial for people. The other sort of key point that was eventually incorporated when we had the appropriate staff or enough staff, we were able to offer free walk-in counseling sessions as well and case management. So you would come in because you had a cut or you needed, some new medication, and your doctor no longer had an office, so there was no way to get to the hospital on the other side of the island. You would come in for sort of your basic healthcare needs, and you would be offered mental health counseling if you wanted. It was just an offer. So that was really beneficial and really showed how sort of bringing a sort of whole health look at what people might need was really great. And then it became a very social center for people as well. We had a lot of aunties and uncles who would hang out front of the clinic and just chat and build that community back. And Maui and Lahaina is very tight-knit community, and it was really important for people to be able to be together and help each other and do what we call talk story, which is just chat and catch up. And that was really beneficial. But those community spaces were really important. And I think fortunately, we also had, additional outdoor spaces where people could gather, whether it was nearby beaches or parks and such. But I think those are key. When they were finally able to have the high school football team in Lahaina have a home game at Lahaina Luna High School, that was a huge event. And pretty much the entire town turned out. And so any of those kinds of community building, community connecting activities, I think were really important for people, and going forward continue to be.
Yeah, 100%. Well, thank you so much for joining us and sharing space with us. I did want to, push this conversation forward, if we do have a couple of more minutes, but I am thinking maybe for Tap or Steve, this is another audience question, and it's focused on the difficult decision folks are facing, maybe in potentially retreating and then leaving their homes and not returning, and maybe if entire communities should strategically retreat from their homes, and how those decisions are being balanced at the community level. I know that's a conversation that has been happening in New Orleans for many years now. And I imagine that was a conversation that happened in Paradise as well for a lot of people. If either of you, would want to take a crack at that.
Yeah, I can start by saying, I guess, yeah, we've been having that conversation for decades, right? Like, people don't understand why residents return to New Orleans time and time and again, especially after disasters. So I know there is a big push to for coastal restoration to make sure there's no additional land loss. But I think it comes back to how do you ground community values and what it means to be a part of a community? Like, this is where people call home. This is where Vietnamese Americans in New Orleans at least have called home in the last 50 years. They've already been forced from their homes, right? And so they've built a new life here, and they don't see that going away. So I think for us, it's just really like trying to be better stewards of our land by doing nature-based solutions on how to mitigate the impacts of future disasters, but also like really making our claim and stake here in terms of like, the journey that we've been on through several forced migrations from North Vietnam to South Vietnam to the islands because of the refugee experience, the boat people, and now to where we are in New Orleans. And so, yeah, I think it's an ongoing conversation for sure. And there's definitely two ends and two sides to the conversation. But I think the question I usually pose back to people is like, well, what do you define as a home? And what do you define as a community? Because that answer is different for everybody.
Thank you. Steve, did you want to jump in?
Well, our communities was very similar, a very small, close-knit community. And after the fire, we had some county supervisors that was thinking maybe Paradise should not rebuild. We're very close-knit. We're very stubborn, and you never tell Paradise not to do something, because if you do, they're going to do it, and they're going to do it real well anyway. And that's kind of what happened. Our population, it was home. And there was never a doubt that the people that wanted to come back were going to come back. There were people that were traumatized and still have not come back and have no intention. And I get that. We have some where the husband or wife wanted to come back and the other one didn't. And I talk to those people to this day, and the ones that want to come back would still love to come back. But their spouse doesn't want to. We are still seeing people that moved out of state coming back now 6 years later. And it's amazing. And the story that I've heard from every single person that came back and is still coming back is that we weren't home where we were at before. That wasn't our community. This is our community. And I think this is what has helped us rebuild, is that feeling, that sentiment. And it's still Paradise.
Yeah, that is beautiful. I wanted to pose two kind of rapid fire questions for the panel as we wrap up. So whatever one speaks to you, more than the other, you can answer. And we'll start with you, Nancy. But the two questions are, is there like a single policy or tool that you think every recovering community should fight for immediately after a disaster? Or the other question is, what's the most hopeful thing that you have seen emerge from your community since the disaster?
Sure, and I really love that second question and the most, because I think the first one is really is almost a one-word answer, and I think that's transparency. Maybe make it three: transparency and dialogue, because we had a lot of transparency and dialogue. Stumbles initially. I think you may have heard about our temporary disposal site. They're quickly wanting to, as you said, get it cleaned up quick, get going, and didn't have the initial community dialogue that should. But once got over that hump, that transparency and dialogue has made all the difference in the recovery effort, and that is the hopeful bit. I mean, the dialogue and the various community groups talking about truly integrated recovery. It's not just recovery, rebuild. It's like, well, maybe do better watershed management. I talked about climate change and the coastal issues, and people are really taking it seriously, collaborating and talking about various solutions that bring together the needs. I mean, a greenway on the mountainside of Lahaina that can, provide a fire buffer. It can provide ecological restoration. It can provide stormwater management. There's those kind of conversations are being held that weren't being held before. They were all sort of isolated projects for development or whatever prior, and now people are thinking and truly integrated and thinking about their other community members. And so in that regard, I think it's really quite hopeful moving forward. It's not going to be short, but it's very hopeful and for the long-term sustainability.
Yeah, thank you. Steve?
Well, I think we've kind of, my answer is almost the same. Our biggest thing was transparency. People wanted answers. They wanted to know. I think we stumbled a little bit at first with that. We lost a lot of our police officers because we didn't assure them that they would have a town to patrol or a job. We need to do a better job with that. But we're absolutely looking in the future. What can we do to make a safer community for everybody? And one of the things that we're looking at is our Parks and Rec department are buying properties that haven't been rebuilt on the outskirts of town with the idea of basically making a greenway around the entire town. Because during our fire, we noticed that our big parks with all the green lawns and what have you fared pretty well during the fire. So that was kind of the idea, and what we're hoping that we can develop now is a barrier around the town to protect us from the surrounding canyons and what have you, and at least give a buffer and a place to fight the fire. So that's what we're doing now.
Appreciate bringing that into the conversation, Tap.
So I guess I'm gonna go back to the basics in terms of like how to get like residents more engaged. So one of the tools that we put at the forefront or policy is language access. You'll be surprised on how many, like town halls and forums are only done in English speaking languages and not like include the diversified voices that do exist in communities. And so like language access, whether it be like direct interpretation from English to like Vietnamese or English to Spanish, but also like translating it into layman's terms, because a lot of times I feel like these power structures are intentional in how they relay information back because they really don't want people to understand. So language access in that sense is where it's really critical in terms of the rebuilding efforts. Because we do provide like translation headsets and like interpreters, and we have different terms that are translated back to communities that are traditionally not used, we feel that our communities are more civically engaged and that they see the importance of like holding decision makers accountable. So like being directly involved in, citizens diplomacy councils or showing up to like participatory budget hearings, keeping an eye out to everything that comes out in like planning commission. So like people are very protective of like the space that they've come back to reclaim as their home. And they're now looking to like making sure that we hold our decision makers accountable for decisions that are being made for New Orleans East.
Yeah. Thank you. And, thank you, Steve and Nancy as well. I think y'all have really outlined, obviously, the desperate need for community in these moments, but also how integrated and interconnected all of these different issues are. And once people are able to share space with each other, those issues do become a lot more clear, and so do the solutions. And I'm definitely going to be taking that away from this conversation. But I hope y'all have enjoyed what we've had to offer you. And I really do appreciate everyone in the audience for joining us today. I'll hand it back to Kelsey before we close out.
Yeah, thank you so much. I feel like I've been taking crazy notes the whole time everyone's been talking. So thank you for sharing all your wisdom. And we have a long road ahead, but also really grateful to know that there are communities out there who are willing to share their wisdom and lend a hand. So I will release everyone into their Friday. I hope you have a lovely day. And thank you again for joining us.